Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, accompanied by the former U.S. Ambassador to the Court of St. James and now a Reagan Foundation board member, the Honorable Robert Tuttle, who will open our program this evening.
I think that's the first and only time I've ever gotten a standing ovation. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good evening, and thank you all for being here tonight. As a member of the board of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, it's my honor to welcome you on behalf of Mrs. Reagan and all of my fellow trustees. As we begin, I'd like you to perhaps rise in honor of all the men and women who defend our freedom, and please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before we begin the program, there's a few people in the audience that I would like to recognize. Let's start with Secretary Gates' wife, Becky, who we're honored to have with us tonight. Becky? And also joining us are Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Board of Trustees member, Governor Pete Wilson, and the former First Lady of the state of California, Gail Wilson. Two other distinguished trustees of our foundation, Mr. T. Boone Pickens, and our newest trustee, Mr. Ben Sutton. And finally, former California Congressman Elton Gagley. Please, Congressman. This evening, we have with us a true American hero and one of our greatest public servants. After receiving a PhD from Georgetown University, Secretary Gates first answered the call of duty while still a graduate student when he joined the Central Intelligence Agency. After serving in the Air Force, he returned to the CIA and rose quickly. In 1981, he was named head of Director Bill Casey's executive staff. And a year later, he was named Deputy Director of Intelligence. And in 1986, he became the agency's second in command. 3 years later, he moved to the White House National Security Council, becoming Deputy National Security Advisor. And he held that post for the next 2 years when he was appointed Director of the CIA. Now, for most of us, that would be a great career, but he wasn't finished yet. After a decade of lecturing and other roles at numerous universities and serving on corporate and nonprofit boards, in 2001, he became the president of Texas A&M. And in 2006, at a time of extreme national need, President George W. Bush appointed Bob Gates Secretary of Defense. I think we all know the story, how Secretary Gates implemented President Bush's call for a troop surge in Iraq, how the surge turned around and all but won the war there. I agree. How President Obama saw in Bob Gates a man of integrity and ability and asked him to remain at his post when his administration took office. How Secretary Gates also implemented President Obama's surge in Afghanistan. And now, after having left the Pentagon in 2011, he has published his memoirs, a volume appropriately titled Duty, a Memoir of a Secretary at War. And as someone who's read 300 pages, I can tell you it is a book of history from a man of wisdom. And I found out today that for the second week in a row, it's #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. So if you would all please join in welcoming an American hero, a man in whom 8 presidents, including President Reagan, have placed their highest trust, a man of duty, Secretary Robert Gates. It's all yours, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to thank the board of the Reagan Presidential Foundation for inviting me tonight and hosting me. It was 5 below zero when I left Chicago this morning, so I'm really happy to be in California. It's always a pleasure to be here at the library and here in Southern California, although I have to tell you it's a pleasure to be anywhere but Washington, D.C. Place where there's so many people lost in thought because it's such unfamiliar territory. The only place you can see a prominent person walking down Lover's Lane holding his own hand. A place from which I expect to receive far fewer Christmas cards in the future. So a word about the neck brace. New Year's Day, I was sitting at the kitchen table with Becky, and we were having a conversation, and I just mentioned in passing that I was thinking maybe about going back into government again. And the next thing I knew, I woke up in the ER with a broken neck and bleeding. But seriously, before I became Secretary of Defense, I had never had a broken bone or a surgery. Then as Secretary in 2008, I fell on the ice and broke my shoulder, my right shoulder, in 3 places. And 10 months later, tore the bicep tendon in my left arm and needed surgery. And my security team at Defense quickly concluded that Al-Qaeda was no danger to me whatsoever. Particularly when compared to my capacity for doing serious damage to myself. And in fact, I have to admit that I simply tripped on a rug on New Year's Day, and so here I am with a fractured first vertebrae. So, on to the book. Let me read the first 2 sentences of the first chapter. I had become president of Texas A&M in August 2002. And by October 2006, I was well into my 5th year. I was very happy there. And then on November 8th, 2006, just as President George W. Bush was announcing he would nominate me as Secretary of Defense, I arranged for an email to be sent from me to the entire A&M University community. And it said in part, I quote, I must tell you that while I chose Texas A&M over returning to government as Director of National Intelligence in 2005, much has happened both here and around the world since then. I love Texas A&M dearly, but I love our country more. And like the many Aggies in uniform, I am obligated to do my duty, and so I must go. I hope you have some idea of how painful that is for me and how much I will miss you and this unique American institution. My book, Duty, is about my 4.5 years at war subsequent to that email. It is, of course, principally about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where initial victories in both countries were squandered by mistakes, short-sightedness, and conflict in the field as well as in Washington, leading to long, brutal campaigns to avert strategic defeat. But this book is also about my political war with Congress every day I was in office, and the dramatic contrast between my public respect, bipartisanship, and calm, and my private frustration, disgust, and anger. There were also political wars with the White House, often with the White House staff, occasionally with the presidents themselves, more with President Obama than with President Bush, due in no small part to the period during each of their presidencies in which I served. And finally, there was my bureaucratic war with the Department of Defense itself and the military services, aimed at transforming a department organized to plan for war into one that could wage war, changing the military forces we had into the military forces we needed to succeed. George W. Bush and Barack Obama were respectively the 7th and 8th presidents I had served. I knew neither man when I began working for them, and they did not know me. To my astonishment, I became the only Secretary of Defense in history to be asked to remain in that position by a newly elected president, let alone one of a different party. I first came to the job in mid-December 2006 with the sole purpose of doing what I could to salvage the mission in Iraq from disaster. I had no idea how to do it, nor any idea of the sweeping changes I would need to make at the Pentagon to get it done. And I had no idea how dramatically and how far my mission over time would expand beyond Iraq. As I look back, there is a parallel theme to my 4.5 years at war, and that is love. By that I mean the love, and there is no other word for it, I came to feel for the troops, and the overwhelming sense of personal responsibility I developed for them. So much so that it would shape some of my most significant decisions and positions. Toward the end of my time in office, I could barely speak to them or about them without choking up. Early in my 5th year, 2011, I came to believe that my determination to protect them in the wars we were in and from new wars was clouding my judgment and diminishing my usefulness to the president, and thus played a part in my decision to step down. I make no pretense that the book is a complete, much less definitive history of the period from 2006 to 2011. It is simply my personal story about being Secretary of Defense during those difficult, turbulent years. So why did I write it now and not wait until President Obama left office? Because the major themes of the book, contrary to some of the media accounts, address issues that are important today, not in 2017. How to deal with the Middle East, where the Arab Spring has given way to political and security winter. Whether to attack Iran if the negotiations fail, or to use military force in Syria. How to deal with China in the South China Sea. How much defense capability do we need, and for what? How can you reform Pentagon spending? With a polarized, paralyzed Congress, is a coherent national security strategy possible? What about civilian-military relationships, including between presidents and the most senior officers? Is defense reform possible, given the parochialism and self-interestedness of members of Congress? Is our national security policy too militarized? And finally, in a capital otherwise paralyzed, I actually made government work. Most of my predecessors as secretary were able to cut perhaps 2 or 3 major defense programs that had become wasteful, unnecessary, or so costly that they were no longer of any value. For example, when Dick Cheney was secretary under the first President Bush, he cut two programs, the A-12 fighter and the Osprey. The litigation over the A-12 fighter cancellation was settled last week, 20 years later, 22 years later. The Osprey is still flying. And yet I cut 36 major defense programs, total value to the taxpayers had they been billed of $330 billion. And I got the Congress to acquiesce or support every single one of those decisions. I cut the Pentagon overhead by $180 billion over a 10-year period and got the services to agree to that. And I held people accountable. Figuring out how to make government work is a challenge we face now. These are all urgent questions for today. And with the perspective of a historian and someone who served 8 presidents, I believe I have something relevant to say on each of these current issues based on my experiences and observations as Secretary of Defense for 4.5 years. During those years, I was treated by Presidents Bush and Obama with consistent generosity, trust, and confidence, as I underscore in the book. They both gave me the opportunity and the honor of a lifetime in serving as Secretary of Defense. With only a few exceptions, members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, were respectful and gracious toward me, both publicly and privately. Overall, press coverage of me and my actions was substantive, thoughtful, and by Washington standards, positive and even gentle. In both administrations, I liked and enjoyed nearly everyone I worked with at the White House, the National Security Council, other departments and agencies, and above all, the Department of Defense. Treated better for longer than almost anyone in a senior position I could remember during the 8 presidencies in which I served. Why then did I feel like I was so constantly at war with everybody? Why was I so often so angry? Why did I so dislike being back in government and in Washington? It was because despite everybody being nice to me, getting anything of consequence done in Washington was so damnably difficult even in the midst of 2 wars. From the bureaucratic inertia and complexity of the Pentagon to internal conflict within the executive branch, the partisan abyss in Congress on every issue from budgets to the wars, the single-minded parochial self-interest of so many individual members of Congress, and the magnetic pull exercised by the White House and the NSC, especially in the Obama administration, to bring everything under their operational control and micromanagement, all made every issue a source of conflict and stress. I was more than happy to fight these fights, especially on behalf of the troops and the success of their mission. At times I relished the prospect. But over time, the broad dysfunction in Washington wore me down, especially as I tried to maintain a public posture of nonpartisanship, reason, and conciliation. Every single day I was Secretary of Defense, I was at war with the Congress. In the Bush administration, my fights with Congress were mostly over Iraq troop levels, timetables and deadlines, and war budgets. And when I turned my attention and focus to the overall defense budget under President Obama, I was continually outraged by the parochial self-interest of all but a very few members of Congress. Any defense facility or contract in their district or state, no matter how superfluous or wasteful, was sacrosanct. Every contract defended to the death. In addition to the rampant parochialism and self-serving behavior, my other main frustration with Congress was its failure to do its most basic job under the Constitution: appropriate money. I prepared 5 budgets for Congress from 2007 to 2011, and not once was a defense appropriations bill enacted before the start of a new fiscal year. This dereliction of duty was dramatically disruptive of sensible and efficient management of the department. Beyond all this, I was exceptionally offended by the constant adversarial, Inquisition-like treatment of executive branch officials by most members of Congress across the political spectrum. When the television cameras are turned on in a hearing, it has the same effect on members of Congress as a full moon on werewolves. Sharp questioning of witnesses should be expected and is entirely appropriate. But rude, insulting, belittling, bullying, and all too often highly personal attacks by members of Congress violated nearly every norm of civil behavior as they postured and acted as judge, jury, and executioner. My view of the majority of the Congress: uncivil, incompetent in fulfilling basic constitutional responsibilities, such as appropriations, micromanagerial, parochial, hypocritical, egotistical, thin-skinned, too often putting self and re-election before country. Now you know why I'm getting fewer Christmas cards. I won broad praise from members of Congress and the press for my patience, civility, restraint, and respectful demeanor during hearings. That is only because they could not and did not know what I was actually thinking. Through all that, for 4.5 years, the clenched teeth behind my smile when dealing with the Congress remained well hidden. It was just another battlefield in my wars. It is difficult to imagine two more different men than George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Clearly, I had fewer issues with Bush, as I suggested earlier, partly because I worked for him during the last 2 years of his presidency, when, with the exception of the Iraq surge, at least in national security affairs, nearly all the big decisions had been made. I did cross swords with President Obama on 2 issues. Our disagreements on the defense budget in 2010 and 2011 were explicit, often discussed face-to-face and alone. I wanted to restructure defense spending to make it more efficient and disciplined, reducing bureaucratic overhead and waste, and canceling weak programs in order to preserve and enhance military capabilities. I did not want to cut the overall budget itself, just spend it far more wisely. Obama felt that defense could and should be cut on its merits, but also to give him political space with his own party and constituents to cut domestic spending and entitlements. At least that's what he told me. I never directly confronted Obama on the second issue, which was his determination that the White House tightly control every aspect of national security policy, and most significantly, operations. But I did often raise that issue with White House chiefs of staff and national security advisors. I had no problem with the White House driving policy. That's what presidents are supposed to do. But his staff's intrusiveness, micromanagement, and meddling in operational military matters was unprecedented and drove me crazy. Both presidents were devoted to the troops and did all that could be expected to support them and their families, the wounded and families of the fallen. But there was a significant difference between the two presidents in one respect. Bush supported the troops, but he also strongly supported the missions in Iraq and Afghanistan they had been assigned to carry out. President Obama opposed the mission in Iraq and came to be skeptical of the mission in Afghanistan. I agreed with virtually all of Obama's decisions on Afghanistan in 2009 and continued to support them even as he began to have reservations during 2010 whether the strategy he had approved would be successful. But except for 1 or 2 occasions, Obama seemed detached from the war, failing to tell the troops why their sacrifice was necessary, why their cause was noble and just, why their mission was important enough to risk their lives. This lack of passion troubled me, and I told White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel at one point the president needed to take ownership of the war in Afghanistan, especially after he added 60,000 more troops to the effort, but to little avail. My personal relationship with Bush and Obama was relaxed and casual, but entirely professional. The relationship with both was close enough to allow for kidding and joking around. More than once, when President Obama would comment on the wide array of genuinely tough problems he was facing, I would ask him, "Tell me again why you wanted this job?" I witnessed both of those presidents make decisions they believed to be in the best interest of the country, regardless of the domestic political consequences, both thereby earning my highest possible respect. I liked and respected both men. My time as Secretary of Defense reinforced my belief that in recent decades, American presidents, confronted with a tough problem abroad, have too often been too quick to reach for a gun, to use military force. As I say in the book, I strongly believe America must continue to fulfill its global responsibilities. But we need to better appreciate that there are limits to what the United States, still by far the strongest and greatest nation on earth, can do in an often cruel and challenging world. Not every outrage, every act of aggression, every oppression, or every crisis can or should elicit an American military response. We must always be prepared and willing to use our military forces when our security, our vital interests, or those of our allies are threatened or attacked. But as I say in the book, I believe the use of military force should be the last resort, and our objectives clearly and realistically defined. And presidents need to be more willing and skillful in using tools in the national security kit in addition to hammers. Our foreign and national security policy has become, in my view, too militarized, the use of force too easy for presidents. When I was asked in October 2006 if I would be willing to serve as secretary, I said that because all those kids out there were doing their duty, I had no choice but to do mine. The troops were the reason I took the job, and they became the reason I stayed. Being called the soldier's secretary because I cared so much about them was the highest compliment imaginable. The tone for my tenure as Secretary of Defense was unexpectedly set in an encounter in Washington, D.C. prior to my confirmation hearings. I was having dinner alone in my hotel, in the hotel dining room, when a middle-aged woman came up to my table and asked if I were Mr. Gates, the new Secretary of Defense, and I said yes. And she congratulated me and then said to me with tears in her eyes, "I have 2 sons in Iraq. For God's sake, bring them home alive." Our wars suddenly became very real to me, along with the responsibility I was taking on for all those in the fight. For the first time, I was frightened that I might not be able to meet that mother's and the country's expectations. It only took a few visits to the frontline troops in Iraq and Afghanistan before I began to feel a deep emotional attachment to them, a growing feeling that I was personally responsible for each of them. And I was soon telling kids at the military academies and those on the front lines in Iraq and Afghanistan that I had come to regard them as if they were my own sons and daughters, and that I would do everything in my power to get them the equipment they needed to accomplish their mission and come home safely, and if wounded, to ensure they got the best possible care in the world. What I didn't expect was that I would have to fight the Pentagon bureaucracy itself to fulfill my pledge to those amazing young people whose selfless service and sacrifice contrasted so vividly with so many self-serving elected and non-elected officials back home. My focus as secretary from day one was to force the Pentagon to meet the needs of the troops on the battlefield as quickly as possible, in weeks or months, not years. This would be true for the new heavily armored, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, the MRAPs, and also for other major needs such as intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, reduced medevac response times, and myriad other needs where the requests had languished in the bowels of the Pentagon for months or vanished altogether. There will always be a special place in my heart for all those who served on the front lines in Iraq and Afghanistan, most in their 20s, some in their teens. I never imagined that I would be responsible for overseeing 2 wars and for seeing to the well-being of those fighting them. During World War II, General George Marshall once told his wife, "I cannot afford the luxury of sentiment. Mine must be cold logic. Sentiment is for others." Such icy detachment was never an option for me. Because of the nature of the wars I oversaw, I could afford the luxury of sentiment, and at times it nearly overwhelmed me. It wasn't long before I had signed the orders deploying every single person in an American uniform to Iraq and Afghanistan. Every single soldier, Marine, airman, and sailor who was wounded or killed was in harm's way because I sent him there. Determined never to let the fallen become statistics for me, I asked that every condolence letter I had to write be accompanied by a photo of the individual, along with hometown news stories so I could read what his parents, and brothers, and sisters, and spouses, and friends, and coaches, and preachers had to say, so I could know whether he'd been an athlete or an honor student or had been aimless and found direction through military service. I wanted to know each of them as I hand-wrote the condolence letter. But signing the deployment orders, visiting hospitals, writing the condolence letters, and attending the funerals at Arlington all took a growing emotional toll on me. Even thinking about the troops in private, I would lose my composure with increasing frequency. I came to believe that no one who had actually been in combat could walk away without scars, some measure of post-traumatic stress. And while the wounded troops I visited in the hospitals put on a brave front for me, in my mind's eye, I could see them lying awake, alone, in the hours before dawn, confronting their pain, their broken dreams, and their shattered lives. I would wake in the night, think back to a wounded soldier or Marine I had seen at Landstuhl or Bethesda or Walter Reed. And in my imagination, I would put myself in his hospital room, and I would hold him to my chest and comfort him. Silently, at night, at home, I wept for him. And so my answer to a young soldier's question in Afghanistan about what kept me awake at night, he did. My wars are over. For those who fought, for the wounded and their families, for the families of the fallen, the wars will continue for the rest of their lives. And so this book is dedicated to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That was very moving. The Secretary has graciously agreed to answer questions. And so what I'd like you to do is raise your hand. We have a lot of microphones around the room. Give us a little time so we can get your microphone to you. And please keep your questions brief. I'll start with the lady right here.
Thank you for your service, so I appreciate it. I have a question. Yesterday, President Obama said that Al-Qaeda was on the road to defeat, but I look at Fallujah, I look at the Taliban coming back in Afghanistan, and I look at core Al-Qaeda and I don't see any difference than the affiliates of Al-Qaeda. I'd like you to comment what's going on with the war on terror.
Well, I think what has happened, is that while core al-Qaeda on the Afghan-Pakistani border has been dealt dramatic blows over the last dozen years, culminating in the killing of Osama bin Laden, the reality is that the movement as a whole has what I would call metastasized. And so we now have al-Qaeda in North Africa, al-Qaeda in the Horn of Africa, al-Qaeda in Yemen. Al-Qaeda has clearly come back strongly in Syria and is now spilling over into Iraq and reviving in Iraq itself, in no small part thanks to the policies of Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki, who has given the Sunnis very little reason to support the government in Baghdad. So we have al-Qaeda that has grown up, and I forgot to mention also, in essence, an affiliate in Nigeria as well. So we have al-Qaeda franchises, if you will, that have grown up in a number of different places in the Middle East and in Africa. And I think the difference is, at least at this point, their ability to launch very complex attacks on us here at home, I think, has been dramatically lessened. Their ability to launch attacks in those regions, to attack Americans and other Westerners, to attack U.S. forces, to attack governments we support, and so on, I think is strong. I think that it is premature, to say the least, that al-Qaeda has been dealt a knockout punch, and that it is on its last legs. I think, as I say, I think it's been dealt some severe punches in the Afghan Pakistani area, but as we've seen in Iraq, unless those efforts are continued, I think that the chances of them being able to reconstitute themselves, very much like the Taliban did between 2001 and 2005 in Pakistan, is very real. So I don't think that this challenge that we face, that we in the West, and frankly the secularists in the Middle East face from extremist Islam represented by al-Qaeda, has gone away at all. And I think it would be a serious mistake for us to weaken our capabilities to continue to carry on that fight.
Gentleman right here.
Mr. Secretary, I don't actually have a question. As one that served our country, I just say thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anyone? Any questions up in the?
Mr. Secretary, a question concerning Vice President Biden. How was it dealing with the Vice President when he got so many issues so twisted, so long? How did you go about it?
Well, first of all, it's Washington. And the truth is, in a way, you know, Biden and I have kind of gone back and forth at each other, what I had to say in the book and what he had to say on the morning talk shows and so on. And Joe Biden and I disagree, obviously, on a lot of things. Now, the reality is, in the Obama administration, we actually agreed on quite a bit, particularly in how to handle Mubarak in Egypt in January of 2011. We both were against the intervention in Libya. We both had concerns about the bin Laden raid for very different reasons, but nonetheless. My arguments with Biden go back to the Vietnam War, and you know, I said that he voted against. I said I got asked about this 4 decades comment, and I said, well, it began in the mid-'70s when he voted against the aid package we had committed to give the South Vietnamese as we were leaving. And we basically left them in the lurch, and he voted against that aid package. He voted against virtually every element of President Reagan's defense buildup and policies toward the Soviet Union, including the B-1, B-2 bombers, MX missile, and so on. But the larger point I want to make is, although Biden and I disagreed on things, and we agreed on some things, I don't think we ever demonized each other. And we didn't have a hostile personal relationship. I sat next to Joe Biden in the Situation Room for 2.5 years. And at times, and I write about this in the book, at one point in the Afghan debate, he writes me a little note and says, "Be careful what you recommend to the president on Afghanistan, because he will do what you recommend." So, you know, I think we'd be a lot better off in Washington if people who disagree with each other didn't demonize each other, didn't consider the other guy the enemy, but somebody with whom you just had a different point of view and a different perspective. I think these issues matter. Clearly, so did he. But I fear that this scorched earth politics that are being practiced in Washington are a big part of the paralysis we're facing today.
Let's try someone over here.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. You said that you take it as an honor that you're the soldier's secretary. I'd like to ask a question about what you think and feel about certain soldiers. In Libya, we knew that before the attack, other embassies had taken their people out, that we actually had been bombed. We know that General Ham had talked to Panetta at the time, 15 minutes after the attack, that there was an attack. And Hicks had told Secretary Clinton that there was an attack. Yet days later, Susan Rice was on the networks talking about some man who made a video. But what really bothers me is that after our brave soldiers were taken home, Hillary Clinton said, knowing that it had nothing to do with the video, to the families of the people who were killed, "We got the guy who made the video." I would like to know what you think about that statement, sir.
Well, I don't take a pass on very many questions, but the whole Benghazi thing happened after I left office. So I don't have any knowledge about that other than what you all have read. And so we've got the same information base. For me, I would just make 2 points about it. For me, the critical questions are as follows. Did General Ham offer the ambassador additional support, and did the ambassador turn it down? Did the ambassador request additional security support from the Department of State? And if he did, what happened to that request in the State Department? And if it was turned down, who turned it down and why? And that's, to me, those issues are more important than Susan Rice's talking points. I would also say that, and I was interviewed on this, had I been in Leon Panetta's shoes the day of the attack, I would have made the same decisions Leon did. I would not have sent 1 or 2 or 3 fighter jets to do a wing waggle over Benghazi in the hope of intimidating somebody, partly because thousands and thousands of surface-to-air missiles have disappeared since since the spring of 2011 from Gaddafi's arsenals. So I would have had no idea what kind of risk I was putting those aircraft in. And you don't send a group of special forces people into a situation in which you have zero intelligence. You have no idea how many fighters you're facing, what kind of weapons they have, where the fight is taking place, or anything else, and particularly on just a couple of hours' notice. That's how you get people killed. But I think these larger questions that I raised are the significant ones, and they have to do with how well was Washington responding to urgent requests from an embassy that they were in trouble and needed help well before the attack.
I think we'll try a question in the far back of the room, and then we'll move up to the front of the room.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your compassionate service to our country. With regard to funding for military, I have an adopted military unit from Fort Campbell, as I had mentioned to you, and the previous to their last deployment, their compound was blown up. They lost all of their personal items and military issue. What happened was the Army took our captain's pay to pay for everything that was lost. So we ran around the country finding non-issue items to replace. I fundraised for him and replaced the pay. Is there anything that we as citizens can do to influence the branches of service to make sure that our soldiers and their families do not suffer these types of impacts?
If the facts are as you have described them, I would say that that situation was inexcusable, and I would not have allowed it.
Gentleman here in the front. Well, hold this, just gets you a microphone.
Dr. Gates, in your book, you explain to the American people what it means to be from the Bible Belt. When you were at Wichita High School East, the same years I was at Wichita High School North, go Redskins, and my mother was also...
These rivalries go back a ways.
Sorry, East is the worst. I was also the child of a Sunday school teacher, and she used the same practice on me of making sure that the branch from the tree was as sharp as possible when I got my whippings. And I'd like to ask you, sir, with your broad perspective, meeting our servicemen from all over this country, do you believe that the Bible Belt is really the foundation of the strength of the country, or do those principles apply to the entire country?
Well, I think that those principles, the principles with which I was brought up, I think apply to the entire country. And I will tell you that while the majority of our servicemen and women tend to come from the South, from parts of the Middle West, from rural areas and smaller towns, and the Mountain West, we have men and women from every part of America in our armed forces. And certainly the ones that I worked with and the ones that I met seem to me to have the values that we would hope that our men and women in uniform have. And I think that for the military in particular, integrity and values and their loyalty, especially not only to country but to one another, are the bedrock of what makes them effective on the battlefield.
Lady in the balcony.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here and thank you for your service. In your estimation and personal firsthand experience, is this president willing to place politics above honesty with the American people?
I'm going to answer that question in a different. I'm going to answer a different question. I say in the book that domestic politics were a part of our debates on national security issues in the 2.5 years that I served in the Obama administration, to an extent that I had not seen before in my career. That said, I will tell you that there were several instances in which I know for a fact that the president overruled all of his political advisors and the vice president and did what he thought was in the best interest of the country. His decision to deploy first 21,000 additional troops to Afghanistan in February, March 2009, and then his decision to deploy 30,000 plus more the following November was contrary to the advice of every staff member, as far as I can remember, every staff member in the White House and the National Security Council staff. And while politics were a part of the debate and the discussion, he set the politics aside in those instances and did what he thought was in the best interest of the country. I've described the decision on the bin Laden raid as one of the most courageous that I've ever seen a president make. I was opposed to I'll start over. Vice President Biden was largely against it because he was worried about the domestic political consequences if it failed. I was against it or skeptical of it, not because of the SEALs or doubts about the raid or the mission or anything else, or our ability to carry it out. I was worried that the Pakistani reaction would be so strong to our carrying out this raid, they would close our lines of communication from Karachi to Afghanistan and potentially cost us the war in Afghanistan. So my concern was the consequences for Afghanistan, whether or not the mission failed or succeeded. So in those instances, I saw the president put aside domestic political considerations and make decisions that he thought were in the best interests of the American people.
Over on the left.
Thank you, Secretary, for being here. I was wondering if you could address the frustration with the military, with Blackwater being there under the State Department as opposed to the military department. And from books that I've read, that the military was very frustrated with them and that they caused a lot more damage than they helped. Is that true? And what is your opinion about Blackwater?
Well, let me broaden it beyond Blackwater to just talk about contractors, and particularly armed contractors, because there were more than Blackwater. Part of what I think went wrong in Iraq is that everybody expected the war to be short. And so there was really, I think that the planning for the post-war period was, shall we say, inadequate. And as a result, things happened in Afghanistan. People made decisions based on a short-term perspective. And so each department and agency active in Iraq was allowed to hire their own security contractors. And no one, not the military nor the State Department, had overall knowledge of how many security contractors the United States actually had in Iraq at any given time. And once we finally started to sort it out, first under Secretary Rice, Condoleezza Rice and myself, and then later under Secretary Clinton and myself, we realized the United States had as many had as many contractors in Iraq as we had troops, about 160,000. And they were not under anybody's jurisdiction. And some of them behaved incredibly badly. They killed Iraqis, they drove Iraqis off the roads, they would throw things out of their vehicles at Iraqis. Some of the behavior was very bad and hurt everything we were trying to achieve in Iraq. So mainly under Secretary Rice and I, we finally sorted this out, and a big issue was whether to put them under Department of Justice jurisdiction for criminal activity or under the military code, the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the military commander. And the decision finally was made to put them under the military commander. My attitude was any American or anybody under contract to the American government carrying a gun ought to be responsible to David Petraeus. And we finally got this thing corralled, I think, but it took probably 4 years into the war before we began to get that situation under control. But it was partly because of poor planning, partly because of the short-term perspective. Everybody thought this thing was going to be over 6 months from now or 4 months from now, and it didn't matter which year you picked. It was going to be over in 4 months or 6 months.
We'll go here, and then we'll go to the back of the room.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for this interesting talk. Now, as a private citizen, viewing the events in Washington as we do, I wonder if you would share your comments with us, or your thoughts, about the sagacity of the easing of sanctions on Iran, and in exchange for what?
Yeah, first of all, I think, and let me divide this into two pieces. I think getting the Iranians, I think we should not, we should take as a real possibility that the policies followed by 3 successive administrations actually may have worked. In terms of the Clinton administration, the Bush administration and the Obama administration steadily ratcheting up the economic pressures on Iran. They are under enormous economic pressure now. Their oil exports are less than half of what they were 2 or 3 years ago. And the country is in real trouble. I believe that's what has forced them to the negotiating table. Now, I think we ought to, and I think that to vote additional sanctions now would be a big mistake. It probably would blow up the negotiations. However, here's the big however, and it's two factors affecting the outcome of the negotiations. First of all, I believe we ought to set a precise date on which the negotiations end. We've said it's a 6-month negotiation. We ought to figure out when that 6 months is up, and that date, whatever it is, ought to be a drop-dead date. The negotiations will end on that date because nobody is better at slow-rolling a negotiating partner than the Iranians, the Persians. They've been doing it for a couple of thousand years, and they're really good at it. And so, you know, and they will inevitably come up and say, well, we just need another 30 days, or another 60 days, or another 90 days, or whatever. We ought to say, this is the day the negotiations end. And here's where I disagree with the administration. I think that having the Congress, working something out with the Congress, whether, and preferably now, that basically sends the message to the Iranians that if the negotiations fail, you are not going back to the status quo ante. Life is going to get a lot harder than it was when these negotiations began. And here are all the sanctions that are going to drop on you the day after the negotiations fail. It seems to me that that would strengthen the hand of our negotiators. We worry about the hardliners in Tehran. I think maybe let them worry a little bit about hardliners in Washington. And the other thing is an inadequate deal or a bad deal is a lot worse than no deal. And my concern, and my view is, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago by George Shultz and Henry Kissinger on what the outcome of the negotiations ought to look like. I agreed totally with what they had to say. And it basically says the Iranians are going to have to roll back some significant elements of their program so that they are not a nuclear threshold state. And in addition to having whatever inspection regime is necessary to give us confidence they're not cheating or let us know early enough that we can take military action. So I think that getting them to the table is an achievement. Let's see what they can say. The other side of this is that if we negotiate in good faith and the negotiations fail, we're in a lot stronger position with the rest of the world, including our allies, to drop the hammer on them, whether it's economic or military, than we would be had we not gone to the negotiations at all.
I'm sorry to disappoint some of you, but this is going to be the last question, and I'm going to go to the far back of the room.
Thank you. This is related to Benghazi, and what I'd like to know is, since some reading I did indicated that one of the terrorists that killed in Benghazi was released from Abu Ghraib prison, and given that the president has multiple times put time limits on when he was going to disassemble that prison and not have it any longer, I'd like to know your opinion on the status and continued state for Abu Ghraib. What is your opinion? Should it be there?
I think you mean Guantanamo.
Guantanamo, sorry. Guantanamo.
I will just give you a hard-headed political assessment of this. I don't think Guantanamo is closing anytime soon. And there are two reasons. First, there are probably still dozens of prisoners in Guantanamo who have made no secret of the fact that once released, their primary goal in life is to go kill more Americans. So they really are on a list of people that both the Bush and Obama administrations have acknowledged really probably shouldn't be let go. The other side of it is, what are you going to do with them? And the reality of domestic American politics is Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, nobody wants these guys in their backyard. Yeah, thank you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. If any of you are thinking about going into government, or if you have a relative or friend who's thinking about going into government, this book should be mandatory reading. There's dinner for all of you in the Air Force Pavilion. Exit out to the left, but I'd ask you to remain in your seat just for a minute or two while Secretary Gates and Mrs. Gates and our special guest exit to the right. Thank you all.